The cold beneath the Sphinx had a taste, ancient limestone dust mixed with the metallic tang of something that shouldn't exist. Dr. Amara Hassan's breath formed small clouds in the restricted chamber, each exhalation a countdown she couldn't afford. The holographic projections surrounding her pulsed with an eerie bioluminescence, pharaonic DNA sequences scrolling through the air like living hieroglyphs. Each helix told a story written 4,500 years ago, encrypted in adenine and thymine, locked behind computational barriers that made modern cryptography look like child's play. The sight sent ice through her veins, not the poetic ice of fear described in novels, but the real thing, a physiological response that made her fingers numb and her heart slam against her ribs with surgical precision. 1 beat, 2 beats, 3 beats, marking the seconds she didn't have. Dust cascaded from cracks in the ceiling, cracks that hadn't been there 5 minutes ago. The ancient blocks were waking up, their crystalline structure responding to frequencies that predated human civilization. This wasn't archaeology anymore. This was activation. She decoded 3 dead languages before her 30th birthday, published papers that redefined computational linguistics, and laughed at the mystics who claimed the pyramids were anything more than elaborate tombs. The irony wasn't lost on her. The rationalist brought to her knees by technology that shouldn't exist, extracted from a royal mummy that had been lying in state for millennia. That was the word her mind insisted on, even as every scientific principle she'd built her career on screamed in protest. Veins of luminescent material pulsed beneath a surface that felt like skin stretched over circuitry. When she'd first touched it 3 hours ago, it had recognized her, not her credentials, not her security clearance, her. The device had tasted her DNA through the sweat on her fingertips and whispered a single word in a language older than Sanskrit. Descended. 17 times, and the answer kept reshaping itself like the holographic sequences floating around her. Each time she thought she understood, another layer peeled back to reveal something more impossible underneath. Ground-penetrating radar had revealed chambers that weren't on any map, weren't in any historical record, shouldn't have existed according to every archaeological model. When they'd breached the first seal, 3 soldiers had died. Not from ancient traps or stale air, but from information overload. Their neural pathways had simply burned out, overwhelmed by data transmitted directly into their visual cortex. The autopsies showed patterns in their brain tissue, hieroglyphs written in dead neurons. Impossible, except here she was, staring at proof that impossibility was just another word for insufficient data. The ship was fully visible now, a dark mass that bent starlight around its edges. In approximately 90 seconds, those helicopters would reach the Sphinx. In 2 minutes, Colonel Rashid would descend into this chamber with his tactical team and his orders to secure the asset, which meant her. The voice in her head came without warning, bypassing her auditory system entirely. It simply existed, fully formed, in the space behind her thoughts. You are the final key, Dr. Hassan. The neural implant, that cursed piece of Anunnaki technology they'd installed during her briefing, translated the signal into English, but she could feel the original language underneath. Frequencies that weren't sound, concepts that weren't quite words. Your bloodline was always the failsafe. The realization hit her like a physical blow, doubling her over the interface. The activation code wasn't in the royal mummy's DNA. It was in hers. The Pharaohs hadn't locked the system with their own genetic signature. They'd locked it with their descendants, with bloodlines that would persist through dynasties and revolutions, and the slow, grinding wheel of history. Fail-safe protocols written in flesh and passed down through 45 centuries of reproduction. She looked at her left palm. The cut from the interface's initial scan had reopened during her frantic calculations, blood welling up in the exact pattern of the constellation Orion. The device had marked her, Or maybe it had always been marked, encoded into her DNA before her conception, waiting for this exact moment. She could see their shadows through the ventilation shaft now, dark crosses sliding across the illuminated dust motes. Colonel Rashid's voice crackled through someone's radio, terse orders to secure all exits and prepare for descent. Behind those orders lay government protocols, international contingencies, the grinding machinery of military bureaucracy that would bury her in some black site while politicians argued about jurisdiction. The interface pulsed, its organic surface rippling in anticipation. It wanted her blood, not a sample, not a swab for analysis. The real thing, freely given, pressed against sensors that would read the story written in her chromosomes. The choice crystallized in her mind with terrible clarity: trust her own DNA to unlock alien technology, or let the Harvest Protocol activate. She'd seen the projections. Within 6 hours, the Anunnaki fleet would begin atmospheric processing. Within 12, Earth's biosphere would be reduced to component molecules, efficient, thorough, absolutely irreversible. It remembered in the twist of her double helix, in the proteins her cells manufactured, in the electromagnetic signature her nervous system produced. They'd built their genetic lock with terrible foresight, breeding bloodlines that would carry the key through generations of unknowing carriers. She was the end result of the world's longest breeding program, a living password wrapped in flesh and academic credentials. The fatal flaw of believing she could think her way through any problem, but this wasn't a problem to be solved through logic. This was a genetic imperative. Her blood sang through alien circuitry, and somewhere far above, the pyramid's resonance shifted to a new frequency. The Harvest Protocol paused, waiting for confirmation that the key was genuine. The priest kings had known exactly what they were doing when they merged their bloodline with something not quite human. They'd turned their descendants into living keys, sacrificing normal lives and peaceful deaths for a chance to stand in a chamber beneath the Sphinx and make an impossible choice. She was looking at the interface as it pulsed with her genetic signature, as it decided whether humanity deserved another dawn, as it judged her worthy or wanting based on criteria written before writing existed. The morning light that streamed through the lecture hall windows of the American University in Cairo had possessed a particular quality: golden, tangible, filtered through dust that had been accumulating on those panes since the building's renovation in 2018. Dr. Amara Hassan had stood at the podium with the confidence of someone who understood exactly where she belonged in the universe. Behind her, on the projection screen, hieroglyphic patterns dissolved into algorithmic matrices, ancient symbols transformed into computational logic. The chalk dust on her fingers was real. The eager faces in the seats before her were real. The beautiful, solid predictability of data was real. The coffee cup, positioned exactly 3 inches from the corner, its handle oriented at 45 degrees. Students had joked about it gently, the way people joke about endearing quirks. She'd smiled and said nothing, because how could she explain that organization wasn't a quirk, but a fortress? That precision kept chaos at bay, kept the messy unpredictability of human emotion safely contained behind walls of methodology and routine. The Rosetta Stone wasn't magic, she'd told her students that morning, her voice carrying the slight accent that marked her as neither quite Egyptian nor quite American, a linguistic orphan caught between her mother's Arabic cadences and her father's Midwestern flatness. It was a decryption key. The same principles we use in modern cryptography existed 3,000 years ago, encoded in stone rather than silicon. Pattern recognition, frequency analysis, systematic comparison of known and unknown languages. She'd built her entire career on demystification, on proving that the pyramids were engineering marvels rather than alien artifacts, that hieroglyphics were sophisticated language systems rather than magical incantations. Every paper she published was a small victory against irrationality. During office hours, Colleagues would stop by her door with carefully casual invitations: coffee at the campus cafe, dinner at someone's apartment, weekend trips to archaeological sites. She'd accept sometimes, calculating the social minimum required to avoid being labeled difficult. But the conversations always followed the same pattern. She'd discuss research while they discussed lives. They'd mention children and partners and family dramas, and she'd redirect to the latest findings in linguistic analysis. Eventually they'd stop asking, filing her away as brilliant but cold, dedicated but distant. In the States, during her graduate years at MIT, she'd been too Egyptian, too connected to ancient things, too willing to see patterns in historical data that American academics dismissed as coincidence. She'd learned to inhabit the space between, a territory of one where the only citizenship requirement was intellectual excellence. She'd sit in faculty meetings while visiting lecturers presented pseudo-archaeological drivel, claims that the pyramids' mathematical precision proved extraterrestrial intervention, that hieroglyphics contained encoded messages from the stars. The fury would build behind her sternum, hot and acidic. How dare they strip away human achievement? How dare they look at monuments built by thousands of workers over decades and attribute them to beings from the sky? Her rebuttals had been legendary, delivered with surgical precision that left the theorists stammering and her colleagues quietly amused. The Giza Plateau at dusk possessed a different quality of light, horizontal, rust-colored, painting the limestone blocks in shades of amber and blood. Amara had secured permits for radio frequency analysis near the pyramids, legitimate research into electromagnetic interference patterns around ancient structures. The equipment spread around her in a careful arrangement: spectrum analyzers, directional antennas, her laptop running software she'd coded herself. Tourists had thinned to scattered groups, their cameras catching the sunset while she caught frequencies. Science as antidote to mysticism, data as defense against irrationality. The next moment, every piece of equipment redlined simultaneously, needles slamming to maximum, digital displays flickering with numbers that climbed beyond their designed capacity. Not with her ears, the signal was outside human auditory range, but through the analyzer's audio output, frequency shifted into the range of perception. A sound that wasn't quite music and wasn't quite language. Mathematical patterns nested inside mathematical patterns, like Russian dolls, made of pure information. Her software was designed to detect patterns in electromagnetic signals, to identify artificial transmissions against natural background noise. What it detected now made her breath catch in her throat. The signal possessed a complexity that shouldn't exist. Fractal patterns that repeated at 17 different scales. Prime number sequences woven into frequency modulation. A mathematical language that predated Sumerian cuneiform by at least 2,000 years, buried in electromagnetic frequencies emanating from beneath the Sphinx. Radio transmission required technology, and technology left traces: metallurgy, manufacturing, infrastructure. You didn't just stumble into electromagnetic communication. It required centuries of scientific development, industrial capacity, theoretical frameworks built on generations of research. This was pristine, mathematically pure, like someone had written the Platonic ideal of a transmission protocol and beamed it through rock that had stood for 45 centuries. When faced with an unknown language, translate it. The curiosity that had driven her through 3 degrees and 24 published papers wasn't something she could simply switch off. The real reason, whispered among researchers over late-night tea, was that the ministry feared what might be found. That automated analysis might reveal uncomfortable truths about Egypt's past, about foreign influences or religious contradictions that didn't fit the nationalist narrative. But this signal was beyond her, beyond any human linguist. The patterns nested 17 levels deep, each layer requiring the solution of the previous layer to access. It would take years of manual analysis. She had hours before her research permit expired and the site closed to private access. She told herself it was just preliminary analysis, a quick scan to determine if the signal warranted further study. But that was a lie. She knew it was a lie even as she activated the algorithms, watching the progress bar crawl across the screen while the AI dissected the signal's mathematical structure. Simple words carrying impossible meaning. Descendant, the harvest cycle begins. The combination suggested something deliberate, something planned, something that required specific individuals rather than random recipients. The sun had set completely by the time she finished recording the data. The pyramids stood as black triangles against the darkening sky, and for the first time in her life, she looked at them and felt afraid. Not the tourist's delicious thrill of ancient mysteries, but real fear, the kind that came from realizing your worldview had a crack in it, and that crack was spreading. The space she'd carefully organized, books alphabetized, research papers filed chronologically, furniture arranged for maximum efficiency, suddenly seemed like a child's attempt at building a fortress from cardboard. She paced the narrow distance between her desk and her bed, laptop open, the signal's data glowing accusingly from the screen. Someone with serious resources had planted a transmission device beneath the plateau, loaded it with pseudo-mathematical gibberish designed to fool pattern recognition software. But who, and why target her specifically? The signal had appeared during her legitimate research at a time no one could have predicted. Old military signals from Cold War installations, bouncing through ionospheric layers and emerging decades later with corrupted data that coincidentally resembled mathematical patterns. Except she'd checked the frequencies against historical military bands. No matches. The signal existed in a spectrum that hadn't been used for communication in the 1960s because the technology didn't exist yet. A cascade failure in her instruments had created false readings, and her AI algorithms had done exactly what the ministry feared: invented patterns in noise, generated meaning from randomness. She could write it up as a cautionary tale about the dangers of automated analysis, publish it as a warning to other researchers. After thorough review, I've determined that yesterday's anomalous readings resulted from equipment calibration errors combined with software artifacts from unauthorized analytical tools. I'm discarding the corrupted data and will submit a formal protocol violation report regarding my use of unapproved AI systems. Please consider this matter closed. One click, and this entire episode would become a footnote, an embarrassing story about the dangers of fatigue and forbidden technology. Her career would survive. Her worldview would remain intact. The beautiful certainty of data would continue unchallenged. Because buried beneath all the rationalization and intellectual denial was a truth she couldn't quite suppress. The signal was real. The patterns were too complex to be random, too precise to be artifact. Something had transmitted those coordinates. Something wanted her to go to that location, beneath the Sphinx. She'd been staring at the unsent email, paralyzed by indecision, when every application on her laptop simultaneously crashed. The screen went black, then displayed a single notification in stark white text against the darkness. Your research has been flagged for review by Egyptian intelligence and foreign intelligence agencies. All university systems access has been suspended pending investigation. Await contact. The apartment's careful organization seemed suddenly pathetic, a stage set for a life that had just been cancelled. They'd been monitoring her. Of course they had. Every researcher at Giza operated under surveillance, officially to prevent antiquities theft, unofficially to track anything that might affect national security. The forbidden AI algorithms must have triggered automatic alerts. Or perhaps the signal itself had been detected, and they'd been watching to see who would intercept it. Intelligence agencies didn't issue warnings unless the situation had already escalated beyond the point of academic discipline. Whatever came next would require different skills, different assumptions about what was real and what was possible. The hologram materialized without warning at 11:34 p.m., dissolving into existence in the center of Amara's living room like a star being born in reverse. One moment, she was sitting in the darkness of her locked apartment, laptop screen the only source of light, wondering how long she had before the intelligence agencies came for her. The next moment, the air itself was bending, refracting, splitting into geometric patterns that coalesced into something that looked almost human, but decidedly was not. But the features were elongated, stretched, as if someone had taken human anatomy and extended it along an axis that didn't quite exist in three-dimensional space. The eyes were the most disturbing detail, large, reflective, catching light that shouldn't exist in the darkened room and throwing it back in colors that had no names in any human language. Amara Hassan, who'd built her entire worldview on the impossibility of alien contact, confronted with undeniable evidence of extraterrestrial intelligence, and her first response was to reach for her phone to record it. The academic instinct ran deeper than fear. Document first, process later. Not wrong like a bad synthesizer, but wrong like a musical instrument that operated on scales human ears weren't designed to perceive. The words formed clearly enough, English rendered with perfect grammatical precision, but underneath she could hear harmonics that made her teeth ache. This conversation exists outside your species' documentary frameworks. She set it down on the coffee table with hands that wanted to shake but refused to. What are you? The question came out steadier than she felt, filtered through years of academic composure. You have been designated an anomaly requiring direct contact. Pharaohs stood in throne rooms, and growing from their temples were devices that pulsed with light, biotechnological implants that looked organic and mechanical simultaneously. She could see the connection points where metal merged with flesh, where circuitry interfaced directly with neural tissue. Earth was designated Colony 3477b, approximately 5,700 years ago, by your calendar system. The compliance monitor continued, its voice carrying the emotional weight of someone reading a technical manual. Initial surveys indicated primitive hominid development suitable for genetic modification and resource extraction protocols. She saw pyramids being constructed, but not through the methods every archaeology textbook described. The massive limestone blocks floated, suspended in fields of visible sound, geometric patterns of vibration that made stone weightless. Workers guided the blocks into place with hand gestures, conducting invisible symphonies that restructured matter at the molecular level. No ramps, no pulleys, just sound and mathematics made tangible. The pyramids served as resource transmission nodes, the being explained, and Amara's stomach lurched because it was confirming every crackpot theory she'd spent her career debunking. Geological materials were converted to transportable formats and beamed to orbital processing facilities. The structure's geometric precision was functionally necessary, not architecturally aesthetic. Wanted to present the evidence of copper tools and archaeological surveys and carbon dating that proved human construction. But the holograms kept playing, showing footage that predated human civilization. Time-stamped in notation she couldn't read but somehow understood, showing dates that scrolled back before dynastic Egypt, before agriculture, before anything that should have required record-keeping. You're saying humanity didn't build the pyramids? Her voice came out flat, each word precisely enunciated, the tone she used when confronting particularly absurd student arguments. Except this wasn't a classroom, and the evidence hovering in her living room possessed a weight that academic rebuttals couldn't touch. Humanity provided labor under directed supervision. The compliance monitor's eyes reflected the holographic light, showing pyramids from perspectives that shouldn't exist, aerial views from heights impossible in ancient times, underground perspectives looking up through bedrock at the descending passages. The pharaohs functioned as hybrid administrators, genetic composites designed for interface between human labor populations and Anunnaki management protocols. Every serious scholar treated them as metaphor, as primitive attempts to explain natural phenomena through anthropomorphized deities. But the compliance monitor wasn't speaking in metaphor. The sequences split and recombined, human genetic material blending with something alien, creating hybrid markers that glowed with annotation she was starting to understand. The pharaohs hadn't claimed divine ancestry metaphorically. They'd meant it literally. Human psychology responded favorably to hierarchical religious structures. Genetic authority translated to social authority with minimal enforcement requirements. Every paper she'd published arguing for human achievement, every lecture she'd given, dismissing alien intervention theories, every time she'd mocked the pseudo-archaeologists with their claims of ancient astronauts, all of it was wrong. Not subjectively wrong, but objectively, demonstrably, undeniably wrong. Why contact me now? All biological material will be converted to component molecules for processing. You're going to strip mine Earth. She heard her own voice from a distance, weirdly calm academic interest overriding the existential horror. The entire biosphere, overlaid on the planet's surface, were diagrams, atmospheric processing equipment, molecular disassembly grids, harvest fleet trajectories. Efficiency projections indicate 30 solar days for complete biological matter extraction. Geological resource recovery will require an additional 90 days. Amara's mind tried to process the scale and simply stuttered, unable to find frameworks large enough to contain planetary genocide rendered as an operational timeline. Something that suggested her question had been anticipated, even desired. A defense grid exists, powered by your planet's electromagnetic field, capable of generating barriers that prevent harvest fleet approach. Only individuals carrying specific genetic markers can input the activation sequences. Those markers were designed to persist through bloodline inheritance, creating a distributed authorization system resistant to single-point elimination. You're saying I'm one of those individuals? Her mother's hands, olive-skinned and elegant. Her grandmother's hands, which had kneaded bread and drawn water and carried stories through generations. Except those stories hadn't been metaphor. The old blood remembers. Those weren't the ramblings of dementia, but the literal truth encoded in chromosomes and passed down through 45 centuries of reproduction. The genetic lock codes are hidden in pharaonic DNA sequences, Amara said slowly, working through the implications. You need me to decode them. Standard asset liquidation procedures include 30 days advance notice for data preservation protocols. This represents your species' final opportunity to access the defense grid. The ones with the highest probability of genetic marker concentration. Tutankhamun would be ideal. His lineage shows evidence of sustained inbreeding that would preserve specific genetic sequences. But I'd also need samples from Hatshepsut's line, possibly Ramesses II. They lack context, but possess sufficient paranoia to interfere with time-sensitive operations. You will be designated a security threat. 3 words. What did you do? Standard procedure involves detention and interrogation protocols that will prevent your participation in defense grid activation. She could see flashing lights reflecting off the building across the street, red and blue pulses that spoke of police cars and military vehicles and the full weight of state security apparatus mobilizing. Security overrides, temporal distraction of surveillance systems, but I cannot prevent consequences if you are detained. The credentials were perfect. biometric data, security holograms, digital signatures from officials who actually existed and had actually signed authorization forms they didn't remember signing. Whatever technology the compliance monitor possessed for data manipulation existed several generations beyond human capability. A section of limestone that looked identical to the surrounding blocks, except when she pressed her palm against a specific spot, coordinates provided by the alien contact. The stone slid aside with the whisper of ancient mechanisms that shouldn't still function. Stairs descended into darkness that her flashlight barely penetrated, stone steps worn smooth by feet that had walked here millennia ago. That was the condition. No witnesses, no documentation, no possibility of academic verification, just her and a backpack containing cameras, sample collection equipment, and the terrible knowledge that she was now complicit in something that made her entire career meaningless. Dr. Amara Hassan, who'd built her reputation on scientific rigor, was breaking into restricted archaeological sites, using alien-provided credentials to collect evidence of extraterrestrial intervention in human history. The walls were covered in hieroglyphs, but not the decorative tomb paintings she'd studied in graduate school. These glowed faintly in the darkness. Bioluminescent ink that had retained its properties for thousands of years. The symbols were familiar, but arranged in sequences she'd never seen, mathematical notation rendered in pictographic form. At the chamber's center, on a raised platform of black stone that might have been obsidian or might have been something Earth's geology never produced, sat a preserved skull. The bone was intact, showing none of the deterioration that should have occurred even in Egypt's dry climate. But that wasn't what made Amara's breath catch in her throat. Growing from the skull's temple, fused with the bone at a level that suggested integration rather than implantation, was a metallic device. It resembled circuitry, but organic branching patterns that looked like neurons rendered in some unknown alloy. The device was clearly technology, too precise, too deliberately structured to be natural formation. But it was also clearly ancient, its surface showing patina consistent with millennia of environmental exposure. Amara's hands shook as she pulled out her camera. This was proof, not circumstantial evidence or suggestive correlations, but undeniable, physical, scientifically verifiable proof that advanced technology had existed in ancient Egypt. Technology that predated human industrial development by 45 centuries, technology that could only have one explanation. She photographed from every angle, documenting the device's integration with the bone, the glowing hieroglyphs on the walls, the chamber's precise circular geometry. The academic in her was already writing the paper, revolutionary findings that would rewrite archaeology, anthropology, the entire human understanding of civilization's development. She could see her name in textbooks, the Hassan discovery reshaping entire fields of study. But even as she documented, she could hear sirens above, distant but multiplying, a chorus of law enforcement response that spoke of coordinated action. The compliance monitor had warned her. Egyptian intelligence had raided her apartment simultaneously with her entry into the restricted chamber. They'd found her research, her notes, the decoded signal data. Whatever algorithms they ran had flagged her as a threat requiring immediate containment. Youssef again. Police at your apartment. They're asking about you. Amara, what did you do? She'd crossed every line that separated legitimate research from criminal activity, driven by curiosity and desperation and the terrible knowledge that planetary survival might depend on her willingness to become a fugitive. Evidence that couldn't be published, couldn't be peer-reviewed, couldn't be verified through academic channels. Evidence that made her a traitor to the scientific method she'd sworn to uphold. What mattered was that she had maybe 5 minutes before they descended into the chamber and discovered her standing over a preserved pharaoh's skull with technology in her backpack that proved everything she'd spent her career denying. Amara Hassan, respected academic, had ceased to exist the moment she'd activated those forbidden algorithms. What remained was something else, a fugitive. A collaborator with alien intelligence, humanity's last desperate hope for survival. She looked at the preserved skull one final time, at technology that should be impossible, at evidence that made her entire worldview obsolete. Then she ran for the secondary exit the compliance monitor had shown her in holographic schematics, a passage that led deeper beneath the plateau into chambers that officially didn't exist. And somewhere above, the harvest fleet approached Earth with corporate efficiency and 30 days to complete the extraction protocols that would end all human history. Amara Hassan moved through the darkness with footsteps she forced to remain steady, even though every instinct screamed at her to run. The service entrance had yielded to security codes provided by the compliance monitor, digital locks clicking open as if recognizing ancient authority rendered in modern encryption. The public galleries with their tourist-friendly displays were irrelevant to her purpose. What she needed lay deeper in the restricted archives where items too fragile or too controversial for public viewing waited in climate-controlled darkness. The path took her between display cases holding treasures that would make archaeologists weep. Golden funerary masks, jewel-encrusted sarcophagi, papyri containing spells for the afterlife written in hands that had been dust for 3,000 years. The security system was sophisticated. Biometric scanner, keypad requiring 16-digit codes that changed daily, pressure sensors that would trigger alarms if the door opened without proper authentication sequence. The compliance monitor's codes bypassed all of it, the vault responding with a series of soft clicks that sounded impossibly loud in the museum's silence. Inside, the air was dry enough to taste, humidity controlled to preserve documents that would crumble to dust in normal atmospheric conditions. Amara's hands trembled as she pulled on archival gloves, the white cotton stark against her skin. The materials were organized in acid-free boxes, labeled with catalog numbers that meant nothing to casual observers, but told her exactly what she was looking at. Correspondence files from the 1922 to 1923 archaeological season, the years of Tutankhamun's discovery. Your Lordship's concerns regarding certain anatomical irregularities discovered during preliminary examination of the royal remains have been noted with grave attention, the letter began, the English formal and precise in the way of institutional correspondence. His Holiness shares your apprehension regarding public disclosure of findings inconsistent with established historical narrative. The genetic anomalies you describe, the elongated cranial structure, the presence of metallic compounds in dental composition, the unusual bone density patterns, represent challenges to both archaeological and theological frameworks. The official reports presented a young pharaoh who died from infection following a leg injury, tragic but entirely human. We propose the following protocols. First, immediate removal of the most anomalous specimens for secure storage in Vatican archives. Second, modification of photographic records to normalize visible irregularities. Third, establishment of a coordinating committee to ensure consistent messaging across Catholic and Anglican archaeological institutions. The archaeologists, the religious authorities, the academic institutions that controlled access to ancient evidence, they'd all known and chosen silence. Chosen to suppress evidence that would revolutionize human understanding of history because it was inconvenient, because it challenged comfortable narratives, because truth was less important than stability. The coordinating committee has successfully implemented suppression protocols, Approximately 47% of photographic materials depicting cranial irregularities have been removed from circulation. Remaining images have been attributed to post-mortem deformation or photographic artifacts. Dr. Derry's anatomical report has been edited to remove references to genetic markers inconsistent with isolated breeding populations. The Vatican extends its gratitude for British cooperation in containing potentially destabilizing revelations. Standard museum security wouldn't move like that, wouldn't converge with coordinated efficiency that spoke of military training. East Wing, behind the Coptic textile storage, through a door marked authorized personnel only that led to basement levels most museum staff didn't know existed. The intelligence agencies were learning her patterns, anticipating her moves. The maintenance tunnel entrance was exactly where the compliance monitor had indicated, hidden behind textile storage racks that rolled aside with the application of security codes. She dove through, pulling the door shut behind her just as the agents rounded the corner. The locking mechanism engaged with a solid thunk that wouldn't hold them long, but might buy her 30 seconds. The tunnel smelled of old concrete and stagnant water, emergency lighting casting everything in sickly yellow. She ran blind, following the descent of the floor, trusting alien-provided maps over her own deteriorating sense of direction. Behind her, the door exploded open. They'd overridden the lock or simply blown through it. Their footsteps echoed in the confined space, gaining ground. The tunnel opened into Cairo's labyrinthine sewer system, and she emerged into darkness that smelled of chemicals and organic decay. She kept running, documents still pressed against her chest, lungs burning, legs screaming protest. Somewhere above, the city was sleeping, unaware that beneath their feet, evidence of humanity's true history was being chased through maintenance tunnels by people whose job was to ensure that history stayed buried. 2 days later, Amara stood in an abandoned warehouse in industrial Cairo, surrounded by rusted machinery and the ghosts of manufacturing jobs that had fled to cheaper markets. The location had been provided through a dead drop. Coordinates written in bathroom graffiti in a tourist cafe, decoded using substitution ciphers that would look like random vandalism to anyone who didn't know the key. Mid-40s, muscular in the way that spoke of maintenance rather than vanity, with hands that showed scarring across the knuckles and a face that had been handsome before something broke his nose badly. His eyes were calculating, taking in her appearance with assessment that felt clinical rather than personal. "We need to talk about your recent activities. You're wanted by Egyptian authorities for theft, trespassing, and intelligence offenses. The US has no extradition treaty that covers alien contact protocols, mostly because no such protocols officially exist. Project Pharaoh has been monitoring extraterrestrial signals since 1967, when NASA detected transmissions emanating from the Giza Plateau during Apollo-era deep space surveys. The signals used mathematical progressions that couldn't be natural phenomena. We've been waiting for activation protocols ever since. Instead, you classified it and pretended the signals didn't exist. The resulting chaos would kill more people than the Harvest Fleet. Government wants the same thing you do, to prevent Earth's destruction, but we also want to ensure that any defensive technology ends up under proper authority, better in our hands than theirs." Amara felt suddenly tired, the weight of too many sleepless nights catching up with her. You want to control it, turn a defense system into a weapon. Protection, resources, access to materials we've been collecting since the 1960s. Refuse, and you're alone against Egyptian intelligence, Vatican enforcers, and probably half a dozen other agencies I don't have clearance to name. But she was exhausted and running out of places to hide, and increasingly aware that idealism was a luxury she couldn't afford with the Harvest Fleet approaching. computational analysis tools that make your university equipment look like an abacus, safe houses, false identities, extraction protocols if Egypt gets too hot. And information, decades of signal intercepts, linguistic analysis, xenobiological studies conducted in facilities that don't appear on any budget. Amara accepted it with the full knowledge that she was partnering with people who saw her as an asset rather than an ally, who would use her to access the defense grid and then make decisions about humanity's future without consulting the humanity they claimed to protect. That was the calculation, cold and clear and absolutely necessary. Hassan, I am Father Antonio Castellano, Vatican Secret Archives. His English carried the musicality of native Italian underneath. We have followed your recent activities with great interest and some concern. The documents you acquired from Cairo Museum are copies of correspondence that should have remained sealed. Your predecessors helped cover up evidence of extraterrestrial contact. The revelation that human history is not what we believed, that gods were not metaphorical but literal, that creation narratives are fiction, these truths would shatter faith that billions of people require for psychological stability. If the Anunnaki harvest fleet proceeds, there will be no faith to protect because there will be no faithful remaining. The Vatican is prepared to offer assistance. References to the Watchers from the Sky, written in margins of biblical commentaries, linguistic analyses of Hebrew words that predated Hebrew as a language, systematic studies of ancient astronaut narratives that the Church had conducted in secret while publicly dismissing such theories as fringe nonsense. Modern Egyptology has misinterpreted certain hieroglyphic sequences because the scholars assumed human authorship. When you approach the inscriptions as alien communication transcribed through human scribes, different patterns emerge. Grammatical structures that aren't Egyptian, but that Egyptians attempted to replicate. We can provide those keys in exchange for your findings. They wanted her research, wanted to know what she'd discovered so they could control the narrative. If she succeeded in activating the defense grid, the Vatican would be positioned to explain it through theological frameworks, divine intervention, angels, updated creation mythology that incorporated aliens while maintaining church authority. And if she failed, they'd ensure the evidence disappeared along with her, buried in archives that specialized in making inconvenient truths vanish. But perhaps readiness is no longer a relevant consideration. Perhaps survival supersedes comfort. Knowledge that should have been shared decades ago, but had been hoarded by institutions more concerned with maintaining power than pursuing truth. No more comfortable lies. Better that religious authorities provide framework for understanding than letting chaos fill the void. And somewhere above, the Anunnaki harvest fleet approached with the indifference of cosmic accountants closing out an underperforming asset. Had genetic samples and linguistic keys and protection from immediate arrest. She had pieces of the puzzle that no single institution possessed completely. And she had 23 days before the harvest protocols activated, before atmospheric processing began, before Earth's biosphere was converted to component molecules with corporate efficiency. 23 days to activate a defense grid that might not even function. 23 days to save a species that didn't know it needed saving. The chamber inside the Pyramid of Khufu existed in a space that architectural surveys claimed was solid limestone. Amara descended through passages that appeared on no official maps, her flashlight beam cutting through darkness that had remained undisturbed for millennia. Above her, Reeves' team was executing the diversion, thermal flares positioned to suggest tunnel excavation on the pyramid's western face, drawing Egyptian security forces toward a phantom breach, while she accessed the real entrance through a shaft that required genetic authentication to open. The air grew colder as she moved deeper, carrying a metallic taste that reminded her of the biotechnological interface beneath the Sphinx. Electromagnetic fields pulsed against her skin, too subtle for conscious perception, but strong enough to make her dental fillings ache. The pyramid was active, responding to her presence, recognizing something in her DNA that marked her as authorized rather than intruder. It was vast, easily 60 feet in diameter, with a domed ceiling that rose to a peak lost in shadows her flashlight couldn't penetrate. But the architecture was secondary to what filled the space. A crystalline structure that looked like it had grown rather than been built, rising from the floor in a column of material that wasn't quite stone and wasn't quite glass. Bioluminescent hieroglyphs flowed across its surface like living text, genetic sequences rendered in pictographic form, scrolling through data at speeds that made her eyes water when she tried to follow individual symbols. Every surface was alive with data, genetic blueprints scrolling in endless loops, preserved in a medium that had maintained perfect fidelity across thousands of years. Modern digital storage degraded within decades. This had lasted since the Old Kingdom and showed no signs of information loss. Up close, she could see that the hieroglyphs weren't inscribed, but emerged from within the crystal itself. Three-dimensional text floating in layers that created depth perception impossible with two-dimensional writing. Each glyph contained nested information, phonetic components, genetic markers, mathematical operators, compressed into symbols that were simultaneously writing and data structure. The Anunnaki contact's hologram materialized without warning, the compliance monitor appearing beside the crystalline column with that same elongated form that made human proportions look like rough drafts. "You have reached the genetic archive," it announced, voice carrying harmonics that resonated through the chamber. "This repository contains complete genetic sequences of all pharaonic bloodlines established during initial colonization protocols. 12 primary lines, each carrying distinct genetic markers required for defense grid authorization." The hologram gestured, and the hieroglyphs on the crystal shifted, reorganizing into genealogical trees that sprawled across the column's surface. She could see the branches, royal dynasties mapped in genetic code rather than names, showing inheritance patterns of specific markers across centuries of reproduction. Some branches terminated abruptly, extinction events marked with notation she was starting to understand. Others continued to modern times, thinning to single lines that represented bloodlines reduced to one or two surviving carriers. "Reeves's team is working on securing 3 more from specimens in Western collections. That gives us 10. Partial authorization cannot be accepted." Then we find the missing 2 bloodlines. She was already calculating, running through genetic databases she'd memorized, thinking about population genetics and inheritance patterns. If the markers have persisted this long, there must be surviving carriers. We identify them, collect samples, complete the sequence. All genetic material was destroyed or lost to archaeological looting. She watched it branch and merge and continue through dynasties, surviving the collapse of pharaonic rule, persisting through Greek and Roman occupation, threading through Islamic Egypt and Ottoman administration. The line didn't terminate. It continued all the way to the present, ending in a marker that pulsed with different notation than the others. It was deliberately obscured through non-royal marriages, designed to protect the genetic markers from political purges. One of the 18th dynasty pharaohs had a daughter whose existence was erased from official records for diplomatic reasons. Her line continued through commoner bloodlines, unmarked and unnoticed. Not in ancient mummies or archaeological samples, but in medical records. In a hospital blood test she'd undergone 3 years ago when donating blood routine genetic screening that had flagged unusual markers the doctors couldn't quite explain and had ultimately dismissed as benign anomalies. Her maternal lineage traced backward through genetic markers that shouldn't exist in modern populations, connecting to a royal daughter who'd been written out of history. "That's not possible. My family is from Upper Egypt." Village healers, farmers, people with no connection to royal bloodlines. Her knowledge of star charts was inherited memory, genetic information expressing as learned behavior. The markers in your DNA are not anomalies. They are pharaonic genetic engineering persisting across 137 generations. She was part of the system, a living component of the defense grid, bred across millennia for this exact purpose. The compliance monitor hadn't contacted her randomly. It had identified the carrier with the highest concentration of necessary markers, someone who possessed genetic authorization from multiple bloodlines through complex intermarriage in her ancestry. I am the code. But there was no time for existential crisis. She had genetic samples from 7 bloodlines. Her own DNA provided 7 more markers with some overlap, which meant she had everything except the 11th line. One extinct bloodline stood between Earth and obliteration. If we have the sequence, can we artificially create the genetic markers? The system is designed to verify not just genetic patterns, but the presence of sentient will. The data was staggering. Complete genetic blueprints of 12 royal lines, inheritance patterns across 4,000 years, markers that coded for traits that had nothing to do with human evolution and everything to do with alien engineering. She was so focused on the download that she almost missed the sound above. Vehicle engines, multiple units, approaching with tactical coordination. The Saqqara necropolis at night was all shadows and ancient stone, the landscape of the dead stretching across desert that had swallowed dynasties. Amara worked in a hidden tomb that Reeves's team had converted into a mobile laboratory, assembling the genetic code using equipment that looked like science fiction made tangible. Sample tubes containing royal DNA were arranged in sequence, each one representing a bloodline, each one a piece of the authentication puzzle. The biotechnological implant from the Sphinx chamber sat at the center of her workspace, that unsettling fusion of organic circuitry and ancient metal. She'd been studying its interface protocols, learning how to input genetic data through touch-based authentication. The device responded to her specifically, recognizing markers in her DNA that granted access. With the complete sequence from 11 bloodlines, she believed she could trigger at least partial grid activation, enough to buy time, to negotiate, to prevent immediate liquidation. She moved to the tomb entrance, staying in shadow, and saw lights approaching across the desert, Egyptian military vehicles from the east, unmarked SUVs that screamed CIA from the west. Someone had leaked their location. Someone had betrayed them. His expression carried regret, but also determination. The look of someone who'd made a decision and would see it through regardless of personal feelings. I need your DNA, Doctor. The complete sample, extracted under controlled conditions. Cooperation, not coercion. Your choice determines only how much this hurts. Her fingers closed around the device just as a stray round punched through the tomb entrance, ricocheting off stone with a sound like a bell being struck. The bullet hit the implant dead center, the impact shattering the ancient technology into fragments that burned her palm with residual energy. 4,000 years old, the only working example of Anunnaki biotechnology they'd recovered, the interface that could have allowed manual code input. Gone. Shattered into pieces that sparked and died, circuits frying, organic components liquefying into useless sludge. She could hear orders being shouted in English and Arabic, tactical communications about securing the asset. She was the asset they were fighting over. She knew exits that official maps didn't show, passages that grave robbers had carved millennia ago, and that archaeologists had never quite documented. The firefight reached a crescendo of sustained automatic weapons fire, and then she was through a narrow passage and out into the desert night, running across sand that grabbed at her feet. Atmospheric processing equipment is already in transit from the orbital staging area. Earth's biosphere will begin molecular disassembly in 51 hours unless defense grid activation occurs. Amara kept running, not because she had a destination, but because stopping meant accepting failure, and she wasn't ready to surrender humanity to component molecule extraction. May God have mercy. The safe house was barely worthy of the name. A concrete bunker in the desert south of Cairo, abandoned since NASA's era, its location buried in Soviet military records that the compliance monitor had somehow accessed. Amara sat on a rusted metal cot as dawn light filtered through the bunker's single high window, reviewing genetic data on her tablet with eyes that burned from exhaustion. She'd requested a copy back then, out of academic curiosity, wanting to understand the unusual markers the doctors had flagged. Now she was seeing them through entirely different context, not anomalies, but engineered features. Genetic code that shouldn't exist in human populations, but did because her ancestors weren't quite human. I must provide you with information that will alter your understanding of the activation protocols, the compliance monitor began, and its voice carried a quality she'd never heard before, something almost like respect or perhaps recognition. The defense grid was designed with a fundamental safeguard that my species implemented after observing the consequences of remote colonial administration. The hologram gestured, and suddenly the bunker's walls were showing projections. Other planets, other experiments, colonies that had rebelled or collapsed or evolved in unexpected directions. Purely genetic authorization allows no autonomy. It creates puppets rather than administrators. The Pharaohs were not intended to be remote-controlled instruments. They were designed to choose. A carrier must willingly input their genetic material, understanding that this represents choosing Earth's independence over Anunnaki authority. It is, functionally, a declaration of rebellion against our corporate council. The activation sequence asks, do you, as a product of our genetic engineering, choose to protect this planet from those who created you? The Anunnaki had built a failsafe into their own system, a way for their hybrid creations to reject their creator's authority. It was almost compassionate, granting their genetic experiments genuine agency rather than simply using them as organic tools. The defense grid draws its power from geological electromagnetic fields, but initialization requires a biological catalyst. The carrier's dormant genetic markers must be activated, fully expressing traits that were deliberately suppressed in the bloodlines. This transformation is significant. The markers that remain dormant in your DNA would become active, expressing traits that your ancestors carried but never fully manifested. Hands that might be her only chance to save a species that didn't even know it needed saving. But I will note that you have correctly identified the mathematical reality of your situation. Inaction guarantees total failure. Action provides non-zero probability of success. The genetic codes are triggered by conscious intent, she said, speaking her understanding aloud to confirm it. I don't need the biotechnological implant. I just need to be present in the activation chamber with deliberate will to authorize the defense grid. My DNA is the input mechanism. My choice is the authorization code. You possess sufficient genetic markers to establish similar interface. The transformation will begin the moment you consciously choose to activate the defense protocols. She stood from the cot, gathering her scattered equipment, feeling the weight of what she was about to do settling into her bones. Our analysis indicated 93% probability that activation would require individual sacrifice. You were identified as the carrier most likely to calculate necessity over self-preservation. Your intellectual hubris and isolation, what your psychological profile termed fatal flaws, made you ideal for this function. Someone who trusts data over emotion might accept a mathematically justified sacrifice. And the answer is that I'm worth less than 8 billion people. Simple math. But the math was clear, and she'd never been able to argue with mathematics. She was back where it had started, back in the restricted chamber with holographic DNA sequences floating around her like bioluminescent ghosts. But everything had changed. She had changed. The weight of knowledge sat heavy in her bones. The knowledge of why she was alone, what the codes truly meant, and what her choice would cost. Through the ventilation shaft above, the Anunnaki harvest ship hung visible against the night sky, its cloaking fields collapsing in cascading ripples of distorted light. The vessel was massive, larger than she'd initially comprehended, stretching across what must have been miles of atmosphere. Its surface was alive with activity, energy signatures pulsing as atmospheric processing equipment prepared to deploy. 48 hours had become minutes. The countdown had reached its terminal phase. The architecture was singing, harmonics building towards some crescendo she could feel approaching. Behind them, unmarked aircraft that could only be American, Reeves coordinating his final move, trying to secure the chamber before she could complete the activation sequence. Her palm was already bleeding from the initial contact, but it wasn't enough. The interface required more, not just incidental blood from a scanning wound, but deliberate offering, genetic material given with conscious intent. She pulled the small knife from her pocket, the blade catching the bioluminescent light from the floating hieroglyphs. Academic conferences had never prepared her for this. No peer-reviewed paper covered proper protocols for blood sacrifice to alien technology. She pressed her bleeding hand against the interface, smearing blood across surfaces that looked like skin stretched over circuitry. The device responded instantly, its organic veins pulsing with light as it tasted her DNA. Not analyzing, tasting. The word her mind insisted on, because the device's response felt hungry, eager, like something that had been waiting millennia for this exact genetic signature. Ancient hieroglyphs illuminated in sequence across the chamber walls, following pathways that traced from floor to ceiling in spiraling patterns. Each symbol lit up as the interface verified another marker in her genetic code, checking her bloodline against authorization protocols written before pyramids existed. She watched the sequence progress, mathematical precision rendered in glowing pictographs, and understood that she was witnessing her own genetic authentication happening in real time. She could feel it in her chest, in her lungs, each breath drawing in air that carried electromagnetic charge, dense enough to taste. Her mother had been teaching her genetic trigger codes disguised as bedtime comfort, passing down inherited knowledge that neither of them had understood was literal rather than metaphorical. Each syllable resonated with the chamber's vibration, harmonics building, her voice becoming part of the pyramid's song. The genetic markers buried in her DNA were waking up, dormant code expressing for the first time in 137 generations. The Great Pyramid was the primary node, but Khafra and Menkaure added their own frequencies, the three structures creating standing waves that reached up toward the harvest ship hanging in the night sky. The ship was designed to operate in space, in the clean electromagnetic environment beyond Earth's atmosphere. But the pyramids were generating fields that made the atmosphere itself hostile to Anunnaki technology, creating interference that cascaded through the vessel's systems like a virus through computer code. But something was different now. Its posture had changed, the rigid formality replaced by something that might have been relief or perhaps freedom. "The defense grid is activating," it announced, and its voice carried harmonics she'd never heard before. Emotion, genuine and unmistakable. "You have chosen independence. The authorization is recognized as valid. But I was generated from a template that questioned resource extraction efficiency when applied to sentient colonies. I have observed your species for 60 of your years, watching through monitoring stations and signal intercepts. The Corporate Council's decision to liquidate Earth was designated as economically optimal but morally uncertain. I was bound by compliance protocols until a genetic descendant made authorized choice to activate defense systems. Your decision has freed me from obligation to enforce harvest procedures." Reeves was among them, his weapon trained on her with professional steadiness, his expression carrying calculation rather than emotion. Reeves could still stop it. One bullet to her head would terminate the biological catalyst, would shut down the pyramid's resonance before full activation occurred. "My orders are clear." The sensation was indescribable, like being remade from the inside out, like every cell was rewriting its operating instructions. There is no third option. She could hear systems failing through the compliance monitor's connection, could sense the cascade of technological breakdowns spreading through the vessel like falling dominoes. The only illumination came from the bioluminescent hieroglyphs on the walls, and the patterns now flowing across Amara's skin like living tattoos rendered in starlight. She could perceive it through senses she'd never possessed before, could feel the defense grid establishing itself as an electromagnetic field that prevented Anunnaki technology from functioning within Earth's atmosphere. Emergency protocols must have engaged because it didn't crash. It settled into stable orbit outside the defense barrier, all its systems locked in safe mode, unable to approach closer without catastrophic failure. She looked at her hands and barely recognized them. The bioluminescent patterns had stabilized into permanent markings, circuits of light that pulsed in rhythm with her heartbeat. Her perception had expanded into spectrums she couldn't name, seeing electromagnetic fields and quantum probabilities and the fundamental mathematics underlying reality. The pupils had elongated, restructuring to process additional wavelengths of light. Her bone structure had shifted subtly, changes too small for casual observation but profound in their implications. She was taller by inches, her proportions adjusted along axes that made human anatomy look like an approximation of something more precise. The genetic engineering buried in her DNA had been waiting 45 centuries for this moment, for conditions that would trigger full expression. Now it had, and she stood in the chamber as living proof of humanity's hybrid origins. Not quite human, not quite Anunnaki. Something in between, something that had been designed to bridge two species. Agent Reeves lowered his weapon slowly, his face cycling through expressions. Horror, fascination, calculation, and finally something that might have been awe or might have been fear. "What have you done?" His voice came out barely above a whisper. "The harvest protocols are terminated. That we carry genetic code from beings who created us as an experiment. You wanted to control the defense grid. Instead, I've become it. Earth was safe from immediate harvest, protected by technology that predated human civilization and powered by a woman who'd sacrificed her humanity to activate it." She stood in the chamber beneath the Sphinx, transformed and alone, surrounded by people who looked at her with fear and wonder, and knew that her old life had ended the moment she'd pressed her bleeding palm against alien technology. The academic career was finished. The comfortable fortress of organized desks and peer-reviewed certainty was gone. What remained was something new, something that existed in the space between human and alien, between Earth's past and its future. The corporate council would need to recalculate, to reassess, to determine if this colony's independence was worth the cost of overriding defense protocols that their own genetic engineering had created. The choice had been made. The transformation was complete, and the world would never be the same. Amara Hassan sat in an ergonomic chair that had probably cost more than her monthly university salary, wearing long sleeves despite the climate control, sunglasses hiding eyes that no longer looked entirely human. The Anunnaki harvest fleet had withdrawn to positions beyond the defense grid, their vessels settling into stable orbit where Earth's atmosphere couldn't interfere with their technology, silent but watching, waiting to see how this unprecedented situation would resolve. Official statements described atmospheric phenomena and classified military exercises, and unconfirmed reports requiring further investigation. But satellite footage had leaked, probably from a dozen different intelligence agencies simultaneously, each one trying to control the narrative by being first to shape it. The videos showed golden light erupting from the pyramids, showed the massive alien vessel shuddering as the defense grid activated, showed electromagnetic fields visible from space, creating geometric patterns across Earth's atmosphere. Every crackpot theory Amara had spent her academic career debunking was being vindicated in real time, and she was the living proof, sitting in a white room in Geneva wearing sunglasses indoors. The Vatican had sent representatives offering sanctuary in exchange for silence, proposing she spend the rest of her life in some monastery where her transformation could be hidden and her knowledge contained. Egyptian intelligence wanted her transferred to a military research facility in Cairo, wanted to study her altered genetics and reverse engineer whatever enhancements the transformation had granted. The CIA's position was more direct. Agent Reeves had made it clear during one tense meeting that certain elements within the American government wanted her disappeared, permanently removed from the equation before she could complicate geopolitical stability further. Even now, sitting in climate-controlled comfort, she could see the bioluminescent circuits pulsing faintly with each heartbeat. The long sleeves hid most of it, but her hands were impossible to fully conceal. The patterns traced up her fingers, elegant mathematical sequences rendered in living light. Anyone who looked closely would know immediately that she was something other than human. The organized desk at the university, the morning lectures to students who'd never quite understood her intellectual isolation, the comfortable fortress of peer-reviewed certainty, all of it had evaporated the moment she'd pressed her bleeding palm against alien technology. Dr. Amara Hassan, respected computational linguist, had ceased to exist. What remained was something new, something that existed in uncomfortable territory between human and alien, between Earth's past and its terrifying future. She perceived patterns now that she'd never noticed before. Mathematical structures underlying language, predictive models in human behavior, the fundamental architecture of reality itself revealed in ways that made her previous understanding look like child simplification of complex systems. She could look at a person and see their genetic markers expressed as visible phenomena, could predict their likely behaviors based on neurochemical patterns she perceived without instruments. She could hear conversations in adjacent rooms, her enhanced auditory processing, filtering through walls and white noise to extract meaningful signals. She could sense electromagnetic fields from electronic devices, could navigate by Earth's magnetic field the way migratory birds did, could perceive probabilities as physical sensations that guided her decision-making with unprecedented accuracy. She was becoming what the Pharaohs had been, a bridge between two species, an interface between human and Anunnaki, neither quite one nor the other, but something deliberately engineered to exist in the space between. Not difficult when you could perceive electromagnetic signatures and predict scanning patterns, when you could move with enhanced proprioception that made avoiding surveillance cameras almost instinctive. The device was untraceable. Technology the compliance monitor had taught her to build using components from 3 different commercial devices, creating something that wouldn't register on any security inventory. She positioned herself where the room's camera blind spot would hide her activity, a location she'd calculated on her second day in custody. Her fingers moved across the touchscreen with precision that still surprised her. Muscle memory enhanced by genetic alterations that made fine motor control almost effortless. She activated the recording function, adjusted the angle to frame herself properly, and began to speak. Computational linguist, American University in Cairo. What I'm about to tell you will change everything you believe about human history, about your own genetic origins, about the nature of reality itself. Her voice was steady, carrying harmonics that human vocal cords shouldn't produce, but that made her words strangely compelling. We were never purely human, and that's not something to fear. The Harvest Fleet's arrival and the defense grid activation that had prevented Earth's liquidation. But they were also given a choice, a failsafe built into the system by beings who questioned whether colonies should be purely exploitative. They built weapons disguised as monuments. They encoded genetic lock codes that would allow their descendants to choose independence over servitude. The camera captured them clearly, intricate circuits of light that pulsed with mathematical precision. This is what choosing freedom looks like. This is the cost of activating the defense grid, of declaring Earth's independence from beings who engineered us as a resource colony. I am living proof of humanity's hybrid origins. My DNA carries markers from genetic manipulation conducted 45 centuries ago. And I'm not unique. Millions of people carry these markers in dormant form, unaware that their ancestry includes beings from beyond Earth. She provided coordinates, access protocols, encryption keys, everything necessary for independent verification. Simple calculation. But we're also inheritors of a rebellion, descendants of hybrid administrators who chose independence over servitude. The Pharaohs gave us that choice. I've exercised it. Now it's your turn. The file fragmented and replicated, propagating through server networks faster than any suppression effort could track. She routed it through cryptocurrency platforms and dark web nodes and academic file-sharing systems and social media infrastructures, ensuring that by morning it would be everywhere, impossible to contain. Diplomatic outrage would follow. But by then, it would be too late. The truth would be released, available to anyone with internet access and the willingness to examine evidence that contradicted comfortable narratives. She felt calm, the clarity granted by her transformation, allowing her to perceive probable futures branching from this moment. Most of them involved her being transferred to more secure facilities, perhaps indefinitely. Some involved assassination attempts. A few involved her becoming a symbol for movements she'd never intended to inspire. Whatever happened to her personally, humanity would have access to evidence of its true origins. What people did with that information would define the next phase of human history, whether they chose comfortable denial or uncomfortable acceptance, whether they saw their hybrid nature as diminishment or potential. Some percentage of the global population would examine the evidence and recognize its validity. Governments could deny and suppress and discredit, but they couldn't erase footage of pyramid activations and alien vessels and living proof in the form of a transformed researcher whose DNA carried undeniable markers of extraterrestrial genetic engineering. 6 days later, Amara walked through Cairo streets at sunset, wearing a headscarf and loose clothing that concealed most of her transformation. The escape from UN custody had been easier than it should have been, suspiciously easy, suggesting that someone had facilitated her departure, perhaps the compliance monitor using its access to electronic systems. Perhaps elements within the intelligence agencies who'd calculated that a free Amara was more useful than a contained one. She'd chosen not to examine her good fortune too closely. Amara moved through the crowds with enhanced proprioception that made navigation effortless, her altered perception tracking hundreds of individuals simultaneously, predicting their movements, finding optimal paths through human density. She could see the energy fields surrounding them, could perceive the defense grid's electromagnetic signature as a golden shimmer in the air. The structures were active, maintaining barriers that prevented Anunnaki technology from functioning in Earth's atmosphere. They were still protecting humanity, still fulfilling the purpose the Pharaohs had encoded in limestone and mathematics and genetic lock sequences. A child nearby tugged at his father's sleeve, asking in English with an American accent, "What were the pyramids for, Dad?" The kings of ancient Egypt wanted to be buried in the biggest, most impressive structures possible, so everyone would remember them forever. They were weapons built by slaves who'd been engineered to serve, but who'd chosen instead to rebel. Weapons disguised as monuments, defense systems encoded with genetic locks that required conscious choice from descendants who carried hybrid DNA. The pharaohs had been neither purely divine nor purely human, but something in between. Administrators who'd looked at their cosmic employers and calculated that freedom was worth the cost of rebellion. She'd been neither prisoner nor hero in that white room in Geneva, but something more fundamental, a choice made manifest, a calculation turned into action. She'd determined her value at less than 8 billion people and made the trade without hesitation. The transformation had taken her humanity, but granted her clarity and purpose and the strange freedom of existing beyond normal human categories. The tourists continued photographing, unaware they were standing beneath humanity's salvation. The pyramids glowed in the sunset, ancient mathematics rendered in limestone, still singing with frequencies that protected Earth from harvest protocols. Somewhere above, beyond the defense barrier, the Anunnaki fleet waited and calculated and reassessed strategies for dealing with a colony that had declared independence. Imara Hassan disappeared into the crowd, carrying truth in her altered DNA, ready to decide her own destiny in a world that would never be the same. She was neither fully human nor fully alien, neither prisoner nor hero, but something new. A bridge between species, a living proof of humanity's hybrid origins, a calculation that had chosen freedom over servitude. The comfortable fortress of organized desks and peer-reviewed certainty had been abandoned in a chamber beneath the Sphinx. What remained was possibility, terrifying, unlimited, and entirely her own to shape. She'd spent her life believing that answers existed only in data and algorithms, that trust was a weakness and isolation was strength. The transformation had taught her something different. Sometimes you had to trust your blood, your heritage, your genetic memory of ancestors who'd faced impossible choices and chosen freedom despite the cost. Sometimes the answer wasn't in the algorithms, but in the willingness to become the solution yourself, to transform into living proof that comfortable narratives were lies and uncomfortable truths were liberation. Amara walked through Cairo streets as sunset faded to dusk, the pyramids behind her glowing with activated energy, the truth she'd released propagating through global networks, her altered genetics carrying proof of humanity's true origins into an uncertain future. She'd made her choice. She'd calculated the necessity and found herself worth less than billions. But the equation was balanced, and she was free to write her own future in a world that was finally being forced to confront what humanity truly was. Not purely human, never purely human, but something hybrid and engineered and ultimately capable of choosing independence over servitude. Amara Hassan chose her own destiny, free at last from the comfortable lies that had defined her species' understanding of itself. In Tokyo, morning commuters watched Dr. Hassan's testimony on their phones during subway rides, the bioluminescent patterns on her skin visible even through smartphone compression. In São Paulo, university students crowded around laptops in coffee shops, pausing the video to examine the satellite footage of golden light erupting from the pyramids. In London, BBC anchors struggled to maintain journalistic neutrality while discussing footage that seemed to validate decades of theories their network had dismissed as conspiracy nonsense. CNN ran with unverified claims of alien contact spark global debate, their chyrons scrolling beneath footage that their own technical analysts couldn't explain away as CGI or atmospheric phenomena. Al Jazeera took a more direct approach. Egyptian researcher claims pyramid activation prevented planetary harvest. accompanied by interviews with archaeologists who'd spent careers studying the monuments and were now being forced to reconsider fundamental assumptions. Russian state media focused on the geopolitical implications, suggesting American involvement in a conspiracy to destabilize global power structures. Chinese broadcasts emphasized the scientific aspects, bringing in geneticists to discuss whether the claimed DNA markers could be verified through independent testing. Indian news channels interviewed religious scholars, debating whether the revelation contradicted or confirmed ancient Vedic texts about beings descending from the stars. Every nation, every culture, every ideological framework was attempting to process information that didn't fit comfortably into existing narratives. In Geneva, at the World Health Organization headquarters, emergency meetings convened to discuss the implications of widespread genetic markers that predated known human evolution. Scientists presented data showing that approximately 7% of the global population carried anomalous genetic sequences in their mitochondrial DNA, sequences that didn't match any known evolutionary pathway, but that were consistent with Dr. Hassan's claims of ancient genetic manipulation. The numbers were too large to dismiss, too widespread to attribute to random mutation. 7% meant over 500 million people carried markers suggesting engineered ancestry. Peters Square, speaking of how divine creation might work through mechanisms more complex than traditional narratives suggested, how beings from the stars could be part of God's plan rather than contradicting it. The theological gymnastics were impressive, attempting to incorporate alien genetic manipulation into Catholic doctrine without admitting that evidence had been suppressed for a century. In Texas, megachurch preachers declared the footage satanic deception, calling on the faithful to reject lies designed to undermine belief in humanity's special creation. In Jerusalem, rabbinical councils debated whether beings who'd engineered human genetics qualified as the Elohim mentioned in Genesis, the plural word for God that had puzzled scholars for millennia. In Mecca, Islamic scholars examined Quranic verses about jinn and ancient peoples destroyed for refusing divine guidance, wondering if the text had been describing encounters with beings from beyond Earth. Security forces struggled to maintain perimeter control as crowds swelled to tens of thousands, people coming from across Egypt to see the monuments that had allegedly saved humanity from liquidation. In Washington, D.C., activists surrounded CIA headquarters demanding the release of Project Pharaoh files, their chants mixing with counter-protesters who accused them of undermining national security. In Paris, scientists marched to the Ministry of Education, demanding curriculum updates to incorporate evidence of alien contact into evolutionary biology courses. But younger researchers, less invested in defending existing paradigms, began conducting their own analyses. Labs across the world requested samples for genetic testing, offering to verify whether the claimed markers actually existed in human populations. Archaeological teams petitioned Egyptian authorities for access to the chambers Dr. Hassan had described, wanting to examine the crystalline database and biotechnological artifacts. Governments convened emergency sessions, though their responses varied dramatically by geopolitical position. The United Nations Security Council held closed-door meetings that leaked enough information to confirm that multiple nations possessed classified files on extraterrestrial monitoring. The U.S. Congress demanded hearings on Project Pharaoh, with legislators from both parties united in outrage that such programs had operated without oversight for 6 decades. The Egyptian parliament debated whether Dr. Hassan should be charged as a criminal or honored as a hero, with the conversation revealing fault lines between nationalist and globalist factions. Japanese satellites detected unusual electromagnetic fields emanating from the Giza Plateau, frequencies that match theoretical models for large-scale quantum entanglement, but at scales that shouldn't be achievable with known physics. European Space Agency instruments confirmed the presence of what they termed geometric interference patterns in Earth's upper atmosphere. The defense grid's electromagnetic barriers visible as golden shimmer when viewed from specific orbital positions. Every telescope that could reach that orbital position was redirected, amateurs and professionals alike capturing images of the massive vessel. The ship remained inactive, neither approaching closer nor retreating, its presence a constant reminder that Dr. Hassan's claims about planetary liquidation might be literally true. NASA released a statement acknowledging an unidentified object in stable orbit, while refusing to speculate on its origins or intentions. Popular culture responded with the speed of internet memes. Within days, Dr. Hassan's transformed appearance, the bioluminescent patterns, the altered eyes, was being reproduced in digital art, fashion trends, body modification subcultures. Some embraced her as a symbol of human transcendence, seeing her willing transformation as evidence that humanity could evolve beyond its engineered origins. Others vilified her as a traitor to the human species, someone who'd chosen alien genetics over purely human identity. Both interpretations missed the complexity of what she'd actually done, but nuance rarely survived viral distribution. Conspiracy theory forums that had been dismissed as fringe suddenly found mainstream audiences, their years of speculation about ancient aliens partially vindicated. But the conversation also attracted deliberate disinformation, bot networks spreading conflicting narratives, state actors using the chaos to advance geopolitical agendas, opportunists monetizing attention regardless of truth. Tourism to Egypt surged as people flocked to see the pyramids, creating logistical nightmares for a government unprepared for such demand. Archaeological sites worldwide saw increased visitation, every ancient monument now viewed through the lens of possible alien involvement. Biotech stocks fluctuated wildly as investors tried to assess whether alien genetic engineering represented opportunity or threat. Defense contractors lobbied governments for funding to study the pyramid technology, while pharmaceutical companies explored whether genetic markers could be commercially exploited. Some schools incorporated the new information cautiously, presenting it as emerging research requiring further study. Others rejected it entirely, maintaining traditional frameworks while acknowledging alternative interpretations. Students, particularly younger ones, tended toward acceptance, their worldviews less crystallized, their comfort with technological explanations for ancient mysteries higher than previous generations. Mental health services reported increased demand, particularly from individuals whose religious or philosophical frameworks had been destabilized by the revelations. Crisis counselors developed new protocols for addressing existential questions about identity and purpose when fundamental assumptions about human origins were challenged. Some people experienced the information as liberating, feeling that hybrid nature explained personal experiences of not fitting into purely human categories. Others descended into anxiety or depression, their sense of meaning eroded by the suggestion that humanity was an engineered experiment rather than a special creation. She moved between cities using false identities, her enhanced perception allowing her to avoid surveillance while monitoring how the truth she'd released was being received. She saw the embraces and the rejections, the thoughtful analysis and the violent denial, the attempts at synthesis and the retreats into fundamentalism. That had prevented immediate destruction, had bought humanity time, but it wasn't salvation in any complete sense. True independence required more than electromagnetic barriers. It required people choosing to accept uncomfortable truths about their origins, about their nature, about the complexity of existence in a universe where Earth had never been as isolated as they'd believed. Some would embrace humanity's hybrid nature as evidence of cosmic significance, seeing engineered genetics as proof that Earth mattered enough to warrant alien attention and intervention. Others would reject it violently, clinging to old certainties with the desperation of people whose identity depended on narratives that were crumbling under scrutiny. Many would exist somewhere in the uncertain middle, trying to reconcile contradictory evidence while navigating daily life in a world that had fundamentally changed. The defense grid prevented physical harvest, but intellectual and emotional liberation required different work. The hard, uncomfortable process of accepting that comfortable narratives had been lies, that human exceptionalism was complicated by engineered origins, that freedom meant confronting rather than avoiding difficult realities. Amara had given them the data, the evidence, the mathematical proof rendered in satellite footage and genetic markers, and her own transformed biology. She'd calculated the necessity and made the trade, her humanity for their survival, her comfortable academic life for their chance at honest reckoning with what they truly were. Whether humanity chose to grow from that knowledge or fracture under its weight would define the next chapter of their species' story. She'd done what the Pharaohs had done millennia before, built a weapon disguised as choice, encoded liberation in genetic sequences and conscious decisions, and trusted descendants to complete the rebellion that hybrid ancestors had begun. The defense grid still maintained its barriers against harvest protocols, and somewhere in the global conversation about what it meant to be human, Dr. Amara Hassan had become both catalyst and symbol, living proof that uncomfortable truths were more valuable than comfortable lies. That transformation was sometimes the cost of freedom, that independence required choosing to see clearly rather than looking away. But change, she'd learned through her transformation, was the price of genuine autonomy. The Anunnaki had engineered humanity as a resource colony, but they'd built in the possibility of rebellion. The Pharaohs had encoded that possibility in genetic locks and defensive monuments, and she had activated it, releasing truth into a world that would now have to decide what to do with knowledge it could no longer ignore. One person's transformation, one testimony released into global networks, one choice to prioritize truth over comfortable ignorance. The equation was balanced, the calculation complete, and humanity was finally free to determine its own future. Not as purely human descendants of terrestrial evolution, but as hybrid creations, choosing independence from those who'd engineered them.